One of the great things about being certainly a writer of mine, I'm sure in your way we can talk about it, is the unexpected people and rabbit holes and fascinating places, literal and figurative, that you go. So
we were match made by Tina Brown.
We were match made by Tina Brown. Tina Brown, we were match made, and basically, long story short, how would you two like to make a TV show set in the Middle East about American diplomacy? And independently we said, yes please, for HBO, and we were matched up, and we were, I think in hindsight we talked, it was the first time either of us had done something like that where you had a real collaborator and it wasn't just you, the writer. And I think we both talked about afterwards, after we got started, that we were both understandably slightly hesitant, and then we discovered that we got on like a house on fire. And we traveled all through the Middle East, especially Dubai and Abu Dhabi, and we made a cracking show, and like most people, it didn't get put on. But we had an extraordinary experience, and which is probably, in my case, sort of still spilling outward to the people I met through Rajiv.
I think we just have to thank the poor sense of HBO for giving us Oslo.
It's very true. It's very true.
You know, if they were smarter, we wouldn't have had this great Tony Award-winning play. No, when Tina first proposed bringing on JT as the writer for this show that never got off the ground, I thought to myself, okay, what TV has he done? No TV. But I haven't done any television myself either. And then I started reading some of his work. The great play set in Rwanda, The Unraveling, and Blood and Gifts, which he wrote before Oslo, which is set in Pakistan in the 80s, during the sort of the new Great Game, as the United States was covertly funding the Mujahideen to try to defeat the Soviets in Afghanistan, and was blown away because I was a foreign correspondent. I had tromped through these places and had written about them as a journalist might, and sort of believed that to achieve that real understanding, you had to be there on the ground, get some dirt in your boots, and that there was a certain way to kind of cover this stuff. And remember being just totally blown away by the fact when I first met and talked to you about your earlier works, that these weren't places that you had really spent an awful lot of time in.
No, in fact, I tried to go to Afghanistan and Pakistan when I was rehearsing to play at the National Theatre, and the British ambassador forbade me because they were so afraid that if I got killed, that would be bad karma. So I actually never, I've still never...
As it often is.
As it often is, as you would know, sadly, with your own colleagues. Yeah, so I actually have never been,
Which is really remarkable. And I didn't have the privilege of seeing Blood and Gifts performed, but I've read it. It reads like the work of a kind of on-the-scene playwright.
I like that, J.T. Rogers, on-the-scene playwright. It's good. I'm going to use that. Yeah.
Well, as a completely random aside, if you walk through some of the corridors of the Pentagon today, not only are there great paintings depicting the First and Second World Wars and the Korean War and even earlier conflicts in American history, but there are, I kid you not, paintings that depict the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan.
Really? Wow.
Yes, wars that have been, in some ways, we have seen through, for those of us who have not been there, people see them through such vivid photography, documentary film, and so forth. And I've got to say, I guess I did meet one combat artist when I was out there, and he had his little sketchbook. But and I say this was no offense to all of these, artists who have gotten government commissions to paint. But but they're really bad paintings.
Yeah.
It's sort of art meets jingoism. But in any event, and so some of these people are on the scene, but so that's here and there. But you never went there, yet you managed to evoke places and people with such intimacy and accuracy. How do you do that?
Well, one of the things, what's interesting, and I'll tangent for a second too, and we'll come back to it. One of the things I was excited about coming to do this talk is one, just knowing so much about this series, I was honored to be asked, but we don't get a lot of time to see each other, and I'm still have so many, when we were building our work together, we didn't have a lot of time to have sort of larger intellectual discussions about writing from journalistic standpoint into narrative and narrative fiction moving to journalism. So I was like, oh, maybe we can just sort of have the conversation here with you that we never actually got to have when we were, building the show about, the debauchery of the American civil service forces in Abu Dhabi. But in essence, the short answer is, as Edward Albee would say, there's always an element of black magic and voodoo, and I used to think that was sort of pretentious, but it is actually, of course, true. You are, summoning things that sometimes come, sometimes they don't. But really, on a sort of practical nuts and bolts level, at least for me, there's a great deal of time, of course, researching and learning about things the way you do as a journalist and as a writer of books. But there comes a point when you're evoking something, specifically for the stage, even more than for screen and TV, now that I've been doing that as well for the last few years. But for the stage, for me, again, only for myself, you're boring down, you're looking for that telling detail. So you're reading research, you're not reading research for facts, you assume you're going to be absorbing that. But what you're looking for is that magic moment where you just go, ah. For example, my play Blood and Gifts that you were so kind about really couldn't have happened if Steve Cull, who wrote the magisterial one-volume book about the history of how we screwed everything up in Afghanistan and Pakistan called Ghost Wars. And so I got to meet Steve and spend a day interviewing him after reading the book, and we've since become quite close, and he's been a great proponent of mine, but he doesn't even remember this, but when he came to see the play, he was just so, with such a, I geek out when people, sort of legends of the field of journalism like Rajiv or Steve like your play. It's much cooler than the New York Times, giving you a good notice. And so he was really kind about it. He said, I love, my God, you wrote that scene where they're in the embassy in Islamabad and it's the Irish embassy and they're all drinking green beer. How did you know how to do that? I was like, dude, you told me that over coffee. He said, yeah, we spent 2 hours talking, and when you said that one thing, I was like, that's going in the play. Because you're looking for those moments, and so you have that aspect of what I'll put in quotation marks, research, but also, and again, it sounds so thought out, but in any kind of sort of long form writing, you realize after the fact, you're sort of following your nose, and you're trying to, later you can realize why you were doing something. But if there is a formula, for lack of a less constrictive word, I would say that you're looking for scenes and moments and places that you say to yourself, yes, sometimes you get to go to a place, like when we got to go to Abu Dhabi, and I would sort of evoke those amazing locations that you took me to. Or in a play like Blood and Gifts where I didn't get to go, you think, I can evoke that room, and those people I can evoke, and these people in that room I can't. So let's build it around that. And sometimes that's in a sort of a macro, and sometimes in a micro. So there's a lot of there's that Shostakovich saying that form will set you free. So for me, it's always a sense of the tighter you can, paradoxically, the tighter as a writer you can draw the box, the more liberating it is. Because right before Blood and Gifts, I tried to read this enormous play about rendition and the secret, the Black Op flights. And this was when this wasn't, was still sort of fresh and horrifying news about 7 or 8, 9 years ago. And I was doing this big commission for the National Theatre in London, which does all my plays over there in the UK. And I spent a year and a half doing this incredible research, traveling all through Egypt, interviewing people who'd been tortured by the CIA and meeting, very sketchy Islamists, mujahideen. And in the end, after a year and a half, I had nothing because I hadn't drawn the box before I got started. And I was like, wow, I've learned a lot about how to drink Turkish coffee in the back streets of Cairo, but I ain't got no play. So that was interesting. Yeah.
I can't think of many
Well,
people
let me turn-
who get to travel around for a year and a half and then not have to produce from
Well,
it.
but that's the funny thing. I don't know about for your work, but for my work, like failure always begets some other kind of success. And not in the sense that it sounds slightly new agey, but everything I end up writing, sometimes it ends up being the thing that you wanted it to be, or you in some nascent way knew. But so often a project will lead to another project that, well, like I right before we did ours, I learned so much about the cohesive sort of crushing down of narrative and the tightness of 60 pages of a TV project that you and I did together that's helped so much just doing other TV things I'm working on now since. But in a more sort of round the houses way, I started working on this play Oslo, doing all this research about what had happened in the secret negotiations that no one knew about that had happened in this castle in Oslo, where the PLO and the CIA were brought together by this young Norwegian couple, and they drank Johnny Walker Black together and got drunk and talked about their families. So when you hear that, you go, yeah, that's a play. So I started doing all this sort of serious research about it, and then I got segued. I was asked to write a film about sort of political skullduggery in the UK that I just couldn't say no to, because it's sort of my bailiwick. And I thought that would take 6 months, and that took 2 years. And it was just such laborious research, and it also sort of very dicey, explosive political material, so he was quite anxious. And in the end, the film didn't get made. And at first I was quite crushed because I'd poured so much time into it. But the skill set that I had to learn on the fly to make a 2-hour film that could condense that much information, when I pivoted back to being a playwright after exclusively working on this film for over a year and a half, nothing else, and with this sort of dread of, oh my goodness, I'll never get this play written now. And then all of a sudden I thought, oh, well now I can actually write this play, because now I have the ability to condense the information with a rapidity and a swiftness that I actually didn't have before. So you just go, you just never know. In the same way that if someone had said to me, you're known for your critically acclaimed but difficult plays, yet maybe one play of yours will move to Broadway and be done all over the world. Which would you put your money on? I would not put my money on the 3-hour play that features Yasser Arafat. You know what I mean? So you just never know, right?
But the 3-hour play that features Yasser Arafat, which I suppose in the annals of Yasser Arafat soliloquies, and it's not a 3-hour Yasser Arafat soliloquy, but 3 hours in that context is short.
Yeah.
You were talking about where failure takes you.
Yeah.
But this was a journey that actually, I dare say, began with success, right? You have this play, the Blood and Gifts play,
Yeah.
and Taye Larson attends a performance, right? Am I mistaken on
Right.
that?
Yeah.
And he's kind of blown away by this, and you get to know him. You perhaps break bread with him, and you start. So here, the Oslo peace process, the peace process of the Oslo Accords, is something that journalists covered extensively at the time. It's been the subject, or there's been books that have touched upon it. So there's been a lot of contemporaneous journalism and some works of kind of modern history that have touched upon it, but nobody's sort of touched upon it. Nobody's come at it in your sort of way. You have dinner with Taye, and it opens this interesting door.
Yeah, well, for those who don't, Taye Larson is now he's quite a legendary diplomat who's served at high all through the UN and sort of been the troubleshooter all through the Middle East for 20 years, and is quite a justly larger than life figure. But when he was a young man, a total unknown, his work, complete unknown, with his wife being a low-level diplomat in the diplomatic corps in Norway, they hatched this crazy idea to make peace in the Middle East. And so, as a much more established person, and I knew nothing about this back channel, he came to see Blood and Gifts, and he asked if we could go out for drinks, and we went out for drinks, and he began to tell me, I'd been told by my director, who directed Bart Scher, the brilliant New York stage director who had done Blood and Gifts and then ended up doing Oslo with me. They knew each other in that New York way through their children's school, went in school together, and he was savvy enough to think there was something there, but also savvy enough not to tell me that he thought there was a play there, so I could discover it and not be like, don't you tell me what to write, I'll write what I want to write. So he said, he loves your play, you just go out, just ask him, just ask him to start talking. So, we went, and I started probing, and 2 or 3 martinis in, he sort of like really started talking, and I was just like, what? With the Johnny Walker Black and the PLO? You know, and I was trying to, when we were rehearsing the play in New York, you know, one of my roles was to sort of, I took on was to sort of keep the actors to understand the sort of the ideas of the play, and that these characters would literally die for their ideas. It's a profoundly un-American concept. But also to really understand the stakes. And I kept saying, you know, the idea that the PLO and the Israeli government would secretly get together and talk and not let the world know and then announce that they made a deal at the time is like the George W. Bush administration and Al-Qaeda drinking booze together and and the stakes of that had gotten out. You know, so again, going back to the original question, you're always in the theater, and similar in film and television, for good work, whether it's sort of historical, political, drenched like mine or not, is you're always looking for what an acting teacher of mine back when I was a student actor years ago said, you know, what's the death factor? Everything has to be life and death, literally and metaphorically. And I think, I'm gonna switch hats and I'm gonna grill you for a moment now. One of the things that, I was so geeked out when when the whole project that brought us together, because I had followed your work for years, both as a journalist and as a book writer. And I mean, can I tell them the story about the Saddam Hussein and the image on the phone? Yeah, so you have to understand, if you're a journalist, like Rajiv, you know, as a young lad was running the whole show, the bureau in Baghdad during Iraq War II. And he was so legendary and such a taskmaster and such a sort of everywhere, one of those, like an octopus, you know, that just to make sure they knew where he was and had to be on call 24 hours a day, all of the Iraqi nationals that were working for him had the sound, when he called on their cell phones, the ringer they chose was the sound of a Scud missile falling, and the picture was Saddam Hussein holding a rifle, right? So that tells you a little bit of your larger than life status. But we've talked about, you know, what interests me about I start from a place of invention and theater and cinema and fiction hood, for lack of a better word, and moving towards and sort of rooting it in real events and then the tension between that. And then I look at your work as, well, interestingly, I almost said a novelist, which of course you're not, but I think there's such a novelistic quality to your books that you come out of this world of rigorous, you know, on the ground, boots on the ground, I think the phrase you used earlier, mud in your boots, just the facts, ma'am, really going native, to use a phrase we don't use anymore. And yet, the thing that's so great about your books is you have that sort of Kapuscinski quality to them, in the best sense, where you do in your books what I'm trying to do from a fictional standpoint, is to put voices and characters, be they imagined or real, on the page and let the reader or viewer make the moral judgment, right? I mean, that's the sense I get. And so my question for you, I'm winding this up here, if this is a question for you. My question is, what is it like sort of toggling between doing work that really is more deeply sort of who, what, when, where, why, you know, and then work where you have the space on the page to do it, but you have this sort of creative and almost ethical ability to sort of get larger, and I'm wondering about that from your point of view.
The short answer is, I don't think I did it very well. The reason is, when you're trying to commit daily journalism, you're so focused on telling the story of the moment, and even if it is sort of more narrative-driven, long-form daily journalism, your focus and your aperture is very different than if you have a more literary project in mind, or something that you're seeking to find those telling details. And you know, in hindsight, I was in Baghdad for 6 months before U.S. troops rolled in, and then for about 2 years after. And I had this phone call with my foreign editor at the time, about 3 weeks after the statue of Saddam Hussein was pulled down, and I was on a satellite phone. It was a sweltering evening. You could hear sort of gunfire off in the distance. It was a scratchy connection, and I was very excitedly talking about, yeah, there's still looting going on here, and buildings are burning, and the Shiite clergy's rising up there, and their insurgents are attacking out in Anbar, prattling on, and he just very patiently listened to me, and then said, Rajiv, in all of this, don't lose sight of the Americans who came to transform this country, who are coming to transform the country. And don't lose sight of how they will be changed too. Think back to the best literature and reportage of the Vietnam War.
Best and the brightest.
It wasn't about the Vietnamese, it was about the Americans and how the Americans were so transformed. And I thought he was he thought it was a nutter. He was sitting there in the comfort of his air-conditioned office in Washington. Yeah. Here I am in Iraq. But I would later sort of break from a lot of my fellow journalists and go in and visit this place called the Green Zone, which was the headquarters of the American Occupation Authority. It was this otherworldly place in the marble-walled Republican Palace where young, neoconservative kids had come from Washington in their pressed khakis and their polo shirts, and were doing things like focusing on rewriting the motor vehicle code in Iraq, or trying to bring No Child Left Behind education policy to the country. Kids who had no experience other than having been their daddy was a campaign donor. We sent over that 24-year-old kid with no background in finance to open the stock exchange in Iraq, and I.
How'd that go, by the way?
Swimmingly, my friend.
Wonderful.
As you might expect. But when I came back and I said, I'm going to write a book about this, I wrote this sort of sprawling proposal. Sonny Mehta at Knopf looked at the whole thing and he saw the paragraph in there about the Green Zone and said, that's what this book should be about.
Yeah, he's smart.
And that's when and a very smart editor at Knopf, urged me to read some more Kapuscinski. And so I remember, reading Another Day of Life, which was this is before Kapuscinski was debunked as a fabulist.
But we can talk about that, because I don't buy that. I think that's just short-sighted factoid nerddom, but we can talk about that in a moment, yeah.
But so we have this book, and he's there in Luanda in the height of the Civil War, as a Polish journalist from the, back then on the other side of the Iron Curtain, and you can he's embedded with the Marxists, and you can taste Luanda on your tongue from the opening pages in that book, and thinking to myself, boy, I wish I had done Baghdad differently. I wish I had, been like the rumpled Polishman in a suit with an attaché case descending upon the Green Zone and going to spend, just a full day with the shuttle bus driver from Kansas, listening to classic rock on the radio as he was shuttling people around the Green Zone, and just told his story. So I felt like I was trying to do some of that in a reconstructive way, but it requires this discipline if you're not coming to it perhaps from the perspective you are, from somebody from my world, to try to isolate and focus in that way.
I'll tell you, it's interesting. I had an interesting conversation with two really good colleagues and friends of mine who are really successful British and really fine British playwrights. It's separate conversations with them this summer. We went out for drinks after they saw Oslo, and they who are both Jewish, and they both said to me, because in New York, the tensions and worries around having a play about with the PLO and the Israeli government get to lay bare in the most raw sense their grievances to each other on stage in the Upper West Side of New York is 180 degrees diametrically opposed from the tensions of that done in the middle of London, right?
Oh, by the way, how did that go for you in New York?
Well, I won the Tony, so I guess it worked out. But no, I'm being flippant. But it was interesting because
before you won the Tony, before the thing opened,
I'm being I was really nervous. We had active shooter policy meetings for the cast. We had safe words and codes, so lockdown, And 6 months before we opened the show in the off-Broadway space of the Lincoln Center, there had been the near riots at the Met on the other side of the plaza over the death of Klinghoffer. So to his credit, Andre Bishop, who runs Lincoln Center, was pretty chill, and everyone else was chill, although I was very nervous until we did the first run-through when the scene happens when the characters are playing, and if you don't know the play, which many of them sure don't, but one character when they're drinking, who's a storyteller, becomes Yasser Arafat, and his nemesis in the play becomes Yitzhak Rabin, and they go at each other. And we did this, and the magic of the theater is that kind of moment. And we ran the first time, and the director and the stage manager looked at me and went, oh, fuck. I was like, I've been telling you people, this is serious. So we then ran around and like chickens with head cut off. But it was sort of fascinating because none of that happened, and the play was sort of successful in a way that transcended even one's own egotistical expectations. You're just trying to do good work, and if you're a serious theater artist in the United States in the 21st century, being on Broadway is just off the table, and you don't worry about, you're just doing your work. So in this case, I think we had when anything is really successful in a fictional form, I think some of it is the quality of the work, but a lot of it is just the luck and the timing, right? So we happened to open a play off Broadway, and in the 7 months we waited before we went to Broadway, because we had to wait for all the actors to be free again, Brexit happened, the US election happened, and by the hair's whisker, right, the Fifth Republic in France almost fell. And all of a sudden, a play that was rigorously only about Israelis and Palestinians or Norwegians in the early 90s was such an embarrassing, obviously, parable about Democrats, Republicans, that I almost rewrote the end of the play because it was too on the nose. And so all of a sudden, the audience is bringing this profoundly emotional experience that was profound to watch, but a lot of it was not me. It was what that's when the theater works, when people have a hunger and they're coming to be told a story because they need to hear something. So we do that. Then we go to London. And we're hunkered down, expecting, because in London the political atmosphere about Israel-Palestine is 180 degrees different. Where in New York, whatever your emotional, religious, or political feelings or thoughts are about this, the Palestinian voice is absent. It has no power. It has no conversation. And in London, it is basically nothing but quote unquote, to be flippant, not to take sides, like all Palestine all the time.
Flipped entirely.
Totally flipped. And so we're waiting for a different kind of blowback, which didn't happen. So that was very moving. And this is what's, among many things, about what's so extraordinary about the theater, and it makes it different from film and television or prose, is that it's always changing. Every performance is different. And you know that as a theater artist, but this play was the sort of petri dish of that experience for me, because you had what I expect will be a unique experience in my career where, I've had a play done at the National Theater, like Blood and Gifts, done on an epic scale at the National Theater, extraordinarily, and then done in a more intimate, by intimate, still 350-seat house, but compared to London, intimate production of Blood and Gifts with a different director, different actors, different cast in New York, and having this blessing, these two crazy great shows, but are so different. But here what we're doing with Oslo, we do a production in New York, we uproot the production, we move it to London, the cast has changed, which of course is no small thing, but the costumes, the set, the choreography, the playwright, the director, the lighting, the everything is exactly the same. And the play is in some ways completely different purely because of the audience. So, and in hindsight, I look back and go, oh, so we did this play in New York City, and if I was, not for political reasons, but for aesthetics reasons, as I do for anything I'm writing, my role is to be, what Yeats said about, I think it was Yeats said about Shakespeare, his genius was he left no fingerprints. So I'm always trying to make myself absent from the work. Like, you couldn't say, that's JT's voice, or that's the JT character. You want to be in all of them and none of them at the same time. But at the same time, you're watching it in secret, like, God, it feels like, I guess it didn't really work. In some ways, it feels a little too slanted to the Israeli point of view. Well, that's just your failing as a writer. Then you go to London, and it's the opposite. And people who saw the play in New York came up in London and said, oh, I love how you beefed up the Palestinians. Like, their arguments are so much better now. I'm like, and I'd go, yeah, thank you. I didn't change a word. It was the collective interest in the intelligence of that British audience and their collective point of view that altered the play. And similarly, all these Norwegian diplomats who just couldn't believe that a play about Norwegian diplomats was being done on Broadway. We did a special performance for the UN, for 1,000 members of the UN, and they just sat there for the first 20 minutes and nobody laughed, and I was just horrified. And I realized they were just so stunned that they were like, this is really on stage? What we do is on stage? So this group of them came and saw the play in London as well, and I went out to drinks with all these, sort of hoi polloi of the European diplomatic corps. And they all said, oh, I love it, just the nuances and the rewriting, and the Norwegian characters are more interesting now. And again, and of course you're like going, what, you didn't like it before? But what it was the actors in both casts were extraordinary, but the actors in New York were Americans. And the actors in London were Euro-focused, intellectual liberal Londoners. And they just, in their bones, connected more with those people. And so, and it's endlessly fascinating to sort of have that back and forth.
It's interesting we're having this discussion on the eve of this sort of improbable and somewhat insane likely summit that our president and Kim Jong-un are going to have in Singapore. Yeah. And if I put that aside for a second, the value of one of the many, many lessons that I take away from Oslo, and I hope many others do, is the value in speaking with your enemy and the power of diplomacy. And it's something that in this present day, as our State Department is getting gutted, when there is disparaging talk about the art of diplomacy, and you think back, in some ways it's been a failing of our country, not just in these recent years, but over time. I mean, you think about how we might have approached the situation in Afghanistan differently if we're willing to have talked to the Taliban, how we could have addressed how we could have addressed Iraq differently, and the list goes on and on. Or the situation with regard to Iran and its nuclear ambitions and a deal that we walked away from. What you do in this play, for all of the many imperfections and failings of the Oslo Agreement and the tragedy that it never got to the hoped for end state, nonetheless shows us the true value in both the statesmanship demonstrated by Taye and the Norwegians, and quite frankly the courage that a group of Palestinians and a group of Israelis were willing to show.
Real courage, yeah, extraordinary courage.
That is altogether sort of lacking too much in this country and much of the rest of the world these days.
Yeah, it's interesting. I have so many thoughts about your thoughts. I had dinner with Bill and Hillary Clinton. They came to see the play. It was quite extraordinary. The audience, at the end of the play, there's sort of a coda and there's footage of the Rose Garden ceremony, and people had realized that he was there by then, and the audience just stopped the show and stood up and gave him a 5-minute standing ovation and yelling thank you, and people were crying, and he stood up and he was crying and I was crying, and it was like nothing I've ever experienced in theater. And this sort of kind of what you're talking about, this sort of welled up of not of that romanticized like, oh, remember back in the day when it was better, but that sense of like, I guess in a way, the sense of there is another way, you know what I mean? Again, going back to my comment about an emotional experience in theater that's not due to you but to circumstance. But I went out to dinner with the two of them for like 4 hours, and which was pretty cool and fascinating. And just hearing them, again, these sort of polarizing and fascinating and world-known figures, and their obsession over this, of these Oslo Accords, and sort of the things that didn't happen and what might have been, and the relations that they made, forged across the table, and how it still marks them, profoundly. And you think about, when I wrote the play, I started doing a press junket, which you end up doing after you've written the play and once you're in rehearsals, and if you're fortunate to have a play done at a large enough venue that there's interest, right? So you're doing the press junket, which I've done in many shows, and this one you start in expecting the questions, and people started asking me, well, so what do you think? Like, was it a good idea that they did this, that this secret back channel that no one was signed off on really, in shorthand, that the public didn't know and didn't vote on? Do you think it was a good idea? Because it's very controversial in Israel, Palestine, and certainly in Norway. And I was sort of gobsmacked. I was gobsmacked because I thought, I never asked myself that question. It was never the point of writing the play. The point of the play was, which is always, going back to maybe your first question about how do you do it, in the sense of, what would it be like to be in those, that magical what if question, as a writer? What if? What would you do? And what would you do in those stakes, and how would it happen? And so then I was forced, thankfully, it's very naive in hindsight, but I didn't think about it until I was done. And I thought, yeah, I could write a whole nother play about, tearing down this kind of idea, which would be an interesting subject. But the sort of historical or ethical lesson that I unintentionally learned from writing it was that, yeah, you have to talk to your enemy, There's that great quote from, I think it's Terence, the Roman playwright from 2,500 years ago, that I think the best translation is, nothing that is human is alien to me. And that's a hard thing to hold on to, I find it hard in our current political environment. I find myself having to remind myself to be a little more loving, shall we say, of the other side on an hourly basis. But I do try to hold to that. And it is interesting. But this is a question, this is a good segue, because I've been flying over here on that little puddle jumper that I thought might end in the ocean from Boston a few hours ago. I was thinking about some of the conversations we had in Abu Dhabi and just your work as a journalist. And there's a question I wanted to ask you, we never got to when we were working on our show. I think paradoxically, this is the setup, and you'll see, I think paradoxically, if my work, or when it's good, it's paradoxically because I'm able to write about these, because I don't go through the experience that you go through, which is living through, for lack of a less simple word, the trauma. So it interests me, so I have the luxury of optimism in a way. And I think that serves it as an artistic engine, but then there's that paradox of like, well, who are you to write this, and all those questions you wrestle with as an artist. But so my question for you is, I'm very struck by the work of yours I've read, but also working deeply on you on a writing project. How do you reconcile? I mean, you've seen some dark things, and you've on a shall we say ongoing basis, in all parts of the world, and had to sort of you have these stories that are just we could just have the Rajivs. Later we'll get a bottle of whiskey and he can just start telling you the stories, and you're like, what? You did what? But I'm struck by the fact that you're not cynical, and also you don't.
We haven't spent enough time together,
No, you're not cynical, but you're also not. You're marked by it, and I mean that both. Watching you as your friend, but also is watching you as a character study, shall we say? Right? You're marked by it deeply, I think, of course, but you're able to not be ground down in a way that I see with a lot of journalists, even great journalists. And I'm sort of wondering, I'm sort of throwing the question you threw out to me at the beginning, the large question of like, how do you manage that? How do you manage to be making interesting work ongoing that's not rooted in that cynicism and that despair, right? That gets hidden by irony in so much of our journalism and our nonfiction writing, but it is ultimately at its core despair.
So the truth is, while my resume may state that I spent 2.5 years in Iraq, the better part of 3 years back and forth in Afghanistan, much of it in southern Afghanistan with the military. I didn't operate, as many of my colleagues did, seeking the day-to-day, bang-bang story, wanting to go out and get every day in the midst of something that was going to blow up so I could have, so that could be the focus of my dispatch back home. I sought to, in the case of Iraq, write about something a little different, write about the American civilians who went to try to govern and rebuild. And not without some pangs of guilt that I was somehow going soft as a journalist, that I wasn't covering the real story, that I was here in this walled off, supposedly secure place, even though it at that time got pelted with rockets a fair bit, instead of being out on foot patrols. And in the case of Afghanistan, my focus wasn't so much on military maneuvers as some of the broader questions. Why are we here? What are we trying to accomplish? Can we rebuild this country? Bigger things like that. Perhaps unanswerable questions. But so I wasn't perhaps coming to it from the perspective of let me isolate the great dramatic moments, but I was not necessarily occupying a space where I was putting myself in the position of having to experience carnage and trauma on a daily basis. I mean, I saw my share of it, but so on one level, I was removed from that. I want to say one other thing real quickly, interject. But after writing the Afghanistan book, a British reviewer, I think in The Guardian, described me as one of the kind of the foremost chroniclers of American failure. And that was, on one hand, I should have taken some pride in that, but I don't want that to define what I do.
I bet you didn't see it that way either.
Not at all.
Yeah, that's the fascinating thing is you write about, like people said, oh, Blood and Gifts is just such a brutal, it's such a downer, and then they all made those mistakes. I'm like, yes, but it's like Greek drama. It's about all these spies from all over the world who are sacrificing their lives to do something, and some of them, I'm going off in a segue, but the number two of the CIA, who we both know, who ran the Stinger missile program, who was sort of the backbone of my CIA research for that play, he and his CIA cohort still maintained that defeating the Soviets in Afghanistan was the greatest success ever had, and yeah, 9/11 is horrific, but of course we should have done it, because what's worse, the Soviet Empire or bin Laden? But when you show any sort of negativity, this, again, I'm taking us off, but it's that fascinating, it's fascinating and a bit perplexing at times to me that the response is, oh yeah, it's so negative, it's about failure. When you're like, not succeeding at something is not the same thing as failure, and stories about people who don't succeed, also, stories about people who don't succeed are interesting. Who wants to watch a movie about someone who gets what they want?
And even in the broader context of something not succeeding, they're great stories of individual heroism and people who are doing things that are remarkable, dramatic, and worth telling.
But let me push on a little bit, because I'm about my original question. Because yes, I think you don't give yourself enough credit for what the things that you did and seen and operated around. But at the same time, again, sort of being in those not only fields of battle, but sort of in the darker places of humanity. I don't mean, and I mean literally in the when people, the crucible experiences. So I'm sitting, it's popping into my head because I'm over there on that stack of books is copies of my play, The Overwhelming, and that play is set against on the cusp of the genocide in Rwanda. Now that I actually went to Rwanda, but again in that weird JT way after I'd written the play. And I was taken there to design, basically to make sure the play held water before we started rehearsals, which premiered at the National Theatre in London. And we found fact-checking, and we found out the play held water, which I was terrified it worked. But what happened, short story to get to the point, what happened is the whole trip didn't become about fact-checking the play, because immediately everyone said, yeah, we read your play, it's great. We can't believe you wrote this play about us, thank you for writing it. It became about everyone I met wanting me to bear witness and listen to their horror stories. So this week or 2 week trip became me listening to people, and sort of the kind of experiences you heard about constantly or saw, in your work over the years where people are saying, you know, the sort of Shakespeareanly horrible things about having to choose which of their own children they murdered in front of them, and you know, and for sometimes hours at a time. And this was one experience for, I can't remember now because of the sort of PTSD of it, for 1 or 2 weeks I came back, and I had kind of for months a level of PTSD. And this is simply being trying to be emotionally empathic to people telling me stories about things that happened to them, as opposed to witnessing or being in. And so when I try to envision being one step further into that process, the way you were, even a small step, to use your, I think, unfair, you know, diminishing of what you've gone through or what you've had the courage to go through, I'm still intrigued as a fellow storyteller how you keep your optimism.
It's hard. I don't think, I mean, I think you probably, well, it's maybe a little different today than it was back then, but I came out of Iraq with next to no optimism. And my initial hope, I mean, I went to Afghanistan, the beginning of my 3 years there was actually after I'd come back, after I'd written the first book, after I'd been the national editor of the Washington Post. Obama gets elected. I'm like, I don't want to edit politics anymore. This is going to be his focus. I thought, all right, these guys are going to finally fix this, and I want to tell that story.
Yeah.
And yet I see a brilliant, earnest young president and a team around him, Hillary Clinton, Bob Gates, Richard Holbrooke, stumble into their own set of make their own miscalculations and make some of their exactly. Yeah. And this is what's so a legacy of these conflicts, not just for the journalists who've covered them, but for those who've served there in all capacities, is that unlike for instance the Second World War, there is no definitive ending. And you're sort of left with that, and I think it. We talk a lot about what the impact of that is for troops, but for those who've been there chronicling it, it has its own toll, and that may be one of the reasons why I sort of pulled the ripcord, 2.5 years ago, to move out west and to say I want to try. I had written this book with Howard Schultz about veterans, and it was back at the paper. I think it was around that time you and I traveled to the Emirates and we were working on the show. And I had one of the greatest jobs in American newspaper journalism. I could travel the world and write long-form stories once a month. I mean, it doesn't get any better than that. I didn't have to blog or tweet or, do it. And Howard said, why don't you move out to Seattle and we can continue to create content in the public interest, and you can, use the resources of Starbucks to make films and try different things and experiment. And it wasn't about selling coffee or promoting the brand. And I sort of blew him off for weeks. And I woke up one morning and I thought, I don't want to wake up having 10 years from now and having regretted not walking through this door. But part of it was I felt like I had spent so many years looking, focusing in on the problem. And, do I want to write, 10 years from now, do I want to be writing my, 500th Wither ISIS story? Is there something else that I can do? And so it was a chance to take my storytelling skills and apply it in a whole different canvas, and one that is actually very much focused now on looking for the good amidst, the trauma that racks our society.
Raji's done this great series of films that he directed, edited, made, called the Upstanders series, which you can get on YouTube or Facebook. And they're these short. They're kind of remarkable. They're you don't even know they're Starbucks, and there's no message. And they're basically like sort of extraordinarily exquisite. These small. Again, our television writing practice, right? Everything's condensed beautifully. And they're taking real people and who are doing sort of extraordinary things for others in American life, and just saying, here, look at this. And it's that they thread the needle so beautifully, because there's no, if I gave you the pitch to any of them, you'd be like, sentimental. But they're not. They're extraordinary. And like what, like 80 million people have watched these things?
Each season has gotten something
I'm
like
very
80 million
jealous
views.
about the 80 million.
Well, it's what happens when you have scale, right?
Yeah. But do you think, you said something a moment ago that was interesting. I was talking with my wife about this. We were watching another, one more Marvel movie with our 15-year-old son, as one does. And it's hard being a Marvel Comics geek who grew up on that, to have that love beaten out of you over the years now. But we're watching these movies, and we were having this conversation, sort of dovetailing, like you're talking about your time in the field and this sort of struggle about this, and the never-ending war, right? And I said to her, I think that someone's going to look back at our cultural product in 50 years and be sort of amazed at the direct connection between our state of war that we all forget. Those of us who aren't the 1% or half of 1% that are actually doing all the fighting in this country. I, who know no one personally on an intimate level who's fighting. And the level of violence and of destruction in our popular culture that's become normal in a way that would have been inconceivable 10 or 15 years ago, even some cases only 5 years ago. That I think it's extraordinary to be someone who's making art and trying to make narrative morally complicated things that can be hard but also beautiful at the same time, to sort of wrestle with this level of nihilism and destruction. I mean, someone is going to look back and say, why did every film that had more than $10 million budget in America have the destruction of a United States city in it? What does that say about our secret desires or fears? If you go watch a Marvel movie, like an Avengers film, and just start thinking about how many people would actually be killed in the 20-minute whatever climax, it's always the same fucking thing. I mean, we're talking tens and tens of thousands of people. And it's just not even in our television shows and in our music. And it's extraordinary. I'm getting the signal, though. We're supposed to move to the Q&A section. Thank you. I asked for that because otherwise we're just going to keep going, and it's going to be endless. So, yes. So let's turn it over to you, as the saying goes.
So many questions to ask. I'm going to actually ask the first question. So JT, in your play Blood and Gifts,
Yeah.
which you sort of described as being set in Pakistan, and it is mostly set in Islamabad, is that right, where these various...
And in the Pashtun, the AFPAC
Right.
region, and the Pashtun tribes are, yeah.
But to me, some of the most moving scenes were set in Afghanistan when the CIA agent goes, he's not supposed to be actually going to Afghanistan. And I'm going to use the word warlord, but that's not quite correct.
Right, he would, but
he
at the
visits-
time the character would have
Yeah.
described himself as
Yes,
that, yeah.
visits this camp. And by the way, one of the things that I really loved about this play is that it's not the slightest bit cynical. I think a lot of, I'm a knee-jerk liberal, like perhaps many people in this room, and regard the CIA in some sort of archetypal way as these villainous people. But I was so moved by the way in which the play shows that through many perfectly good motives, we went in there very naively, not understanding what we were facing. But there's a very comic, but ultimately through the play, very moving leitmotif of the fascination of the men in this Afghan camp where the warlord is with the song Hotel California.
Yeah.
And I wanted to know, where did that come from? Because it really reveals that, the relationship between Afghanistan at that time and American culture, popular culture, when you think of these people as being isolated somehow from the West. Could you talk a little
Yeah,
bit
briefly.
about
Yeah, it came about very, the way that the theater is all about nuts and bolts and problem solving, and so you're again learning what can you convey, what can you evoke, and I was doing some reading in it might have been Steve's book, Ghost War, one of the other memoirs by people I read, and they talked about it became really, really incredibly valuable to have American pop culture on cassette tapes because there was this hunger for it because these kids didn't have any access. There, obviously, there's no internet, there's no mail, so there was nothing. And that anything was like, it was almost like a religious, and again, I'm using my words, not, I sort of thinking about this in the analogy of like a religious, a sacred object. And then very briefly, as a very young child, I lived in Southeast Asia in a very rural village that had connection to nothing. And one of the kids in the village had an 8-track tape that had Hotel California on it. And we'd sit around and listen to it. And even I, as an American, would find it sort of totemic. And I thought, that's what I'm going to use. Yeah.
And it's wonderful how it's so...
Well, then you find the lyrics are like so eerie, like apropos for it. And again, that's just the...
What is the question they keep asking? Who is
colitas? On a dark desert highway. Yeah. Warm smell of colitas. So he has to explain that's actually pot. And they're like, what? Colitas is drugs? My God.
We have plenty of that around here.
Yeah, right. So that is the nuts and bolts answer to that question.
One of the many details
Yeah.
there. So other questions for either of our guests? Come on.
In your play, Oslo,
Yeah.
you mentioned how in New York, it was acted and received in one manner, then you went over to, London, and it was just received a totally different way. Now, I had no idea of the politics and the strength of the Palestinian, thoughts over there. Do you see this happening in other plays? Would it only happen in a political sense of a play?
Well, that's
So let me just
Yes.
repeat the question. So the question was, JT had talked about the difference in the reception of Oslo with a New York audience and the London audience. And so the question was, do you see different receptions for other plays between
yes,
audiences between New York, London, and maybe elsewhere too?
Yeah, in terms of sort of political or ideological ideas, not so common only because American plays almost universally aren't dealing with politics and history and ideas, for better and for worse. But in terms, so that sort of didactic, or not didactic, but like a clear, sharp differentiation, the way that happened with Oslo was more in common. But what is interesting is just the simple, cultural phenomena of plays that are deep and penetrating, exciting, and one, what's the saying? We're two foreign cultures separated and connected by one language. I mean, if you work in the theater a lot, I'm sure if you work in another profession where you're traveling and working deeply in New York, say London, you start to realize how profoundly different we are from each other. So there are, stories that seem beautiful and touching or funny over there that come over here and you're like, what is this? And vice versa. But I think that's surely just, cultural talking points.
Well, are there specific scenes or plot points that you could say were received really differently between New York and London?
In New York, we are a visual culture, and the English are an oral culture. So there's a level of listening that's almost like a physical act with audiences in London, which I love. The audiences at Lincoln Center and some of those theaters in New York are fantastic as well. So it's not that one is better than the other, it's just what is your preference or what kind of plays work best and this, that, and the other. And so, in New York, the thing that was most thrilling is the sort of gut-busting ha-has when the joke that you've been constructing really lands. Because if you're really honest, we're all joke whores in the theater. And so that's like, yes, it works, that's so great. But in London, equally, in some ways perhaps even more satisfying, is a crowd of 1,000 people all going, like some little thing that you just sort of like glanced over and then you keep going. So it's just so it wasn't that a particular line. What's more is that political events, when the play, I wasn't there in London a couple months ago when Trump announced that Jerusalem, we were going to move the embassy to Jerusalem. So you get the show reports from the stage managers, and they were all about when the scenes in the play happen. There's multiple scenes in the play when they're arguing about Jerusalem. He said the tension in the audience was so palpable that the actors were getting, uncomfortable, because the audience was like, wait, are they talking about this? And what if the guy next to me thinks differently than I do? And are we going to have a fight here in the audience? And of course, nothing happens, knock wood, but going back to my comment about how the theater is an ever-changing beast.
Was there any difference in New York? Because you were off Broadway
Yeah.
prior to the 2016 election, on Broadway after.
Totally
right?
different.
How did, what was the difference?
Because Trump had happened and Brexit and this, and so the play became, the one thing, not the only thing, but one thing that is most extraordinary about having a Broadway play is no matter how big a venue, how important and well done a play off Broadway, even at Lincoln Center, which is basically a Broadway, there's really aesthetically and financially and there's quality-wise, there's no difference. But we still live in a country where people who aren't interested or don't even know what the heck a new play is go, oh, Broadway, oh, I should go see that. So you get a much wider bandwidth of people, and then that becomes a challenge to how do you pull them in without watering down what you've done. But when you can, then you have a more interesting conversation because people are sitting, the thing I just endlessly get as a theater artist is, I thought I was going to be bored, but it was actually funny. You know what I mean? And everyone has their theatrical cross to bear. That's mine. I'm going to watch a play about spies in Afghanistan. Jesus. Oh, this joke's about Hotel California. Oh, I like it. And simply, because your job is a storyteller in the stage or any form is you have to entertain. You can challenge, you can provoke, you can do all this other stuff, which is what I'm interested in. But you have to take the audience by the hand and say, now you're gonna come with me, and we're gonna go on this trip together. I don't think that really answered the question, but that's what I said.
Yes.
Would you say more about how the collaboration between the two of you actually happened practically?
Oh,
The question is how the collaboration between our two guests happened on a practical level.
I'm going to start.
Meatloaf sandwiches.
Meatloaf sandwiches. So Rajiv was working at the Post, and of course every other day he was another part of the world, and so I got tired trying to figure out which area code from what country I was getting a mobile phone call from him on. And so we sort of worked out a system where he would say, okay, I know it's short notice, but I'm going to be in New York for 32 hours or 12 hours, next Wednesday, can we get together? And the HBO was great. They gave us space at the offices off Bryant Park. And it was a bit like The Shining, because it was this enormous, there was no one there. The entire floor, so we'd just be wandering the floor of HBO like, there's nobody here. And we first go down, we found this great place that made meatloaf sandwiches down in the park, and we eat these meatloaf sandwiches. And then we'd come back, and we would sit in a room, almost like our two-man writer's room, right? And we would, I'm glad you asked it, because I wanted to talk about this, about you and your process, and how it was interesting what I learned from you, was that I would have assumed, without thinking it through, that Rajiv's focus, which is in hindsight sort of patronizing towards journalism on my part, would be like he'd be the facts guy, you know what I mean, like the facts and the lawyer. And in fact, was the opposite. We both were, came from a different background with lots of information about this. His being, of course, far more than mine. But all Rajiv wanted to sort of spin out was the telling details. Like what are the cool things we can hang this on, and also this sort of, which I think in hindsight I sort of absorbed and learned a bit from you on this, even more than I already knew. This sort of relentless, like, yeah, but what's the story? What's the story? What's the story? And he just wouldn't it was like a dog with a bone, and sometimes I'd be like, I don't know, man, can we just go home? I'm really tired. We'll work out the story arc of section 2 tomorrow or next week. But it was this sort of, right? We're trying to figure out what's the most, and we would endlessly come up with characters and scramble, in essence, right? My memory is like, these are all the amazing possibilities we could have in this based on real people and real events, that he had this wealth of information. And then how do we keep moving the jigsaw puzzles around, to make it the most interesting way, right? I mean,
and there were big themes that we were playing with and plumbing, certainly the sort of the drama that takes place inside the walls of an American embassy, kind of at the frontier, bigger questions about kind of the end of American empire, the fight between sort of the field and Washington, kind of the ugly Americans who are out and about and how they tromp around and break China as they do things.
But then how do we do it? How do we find ways to make that sexy and entertaining without watering down,
I do feel a pang of guilt, given that we were doing this in a sort of a different moment. And I should say we were sort of doing this before Madam Secretary, went on to CBS, and we had this wonderful idea. Our protagonist should be a female ambassador, and damn, CBS stole that one.
Ours was so better.
But there were these sort of sub themes where we were looking at both the sort of the seamier side of diplomats abroad and the mistakes we feel our country has collectively made over the last couple of decades and ways we bring that in, and yet in this moment where there is this attack on what some now call the deep state, but really the honest federal bureaucracy and people who are civil servants who are trying to serve our country with distinction day in, day out, and particularly the Foreign Service.
Yeah.
It makes you feel like, boy, if we were going to do this right now, we'd be very defensive of these people and want to write about them, only in the most flattering ways, right? Don't give any ammunition to people who say that we don't need diplomats or diplomacy. But the best part of the collaboration is we actually made a field trip out to the Middle East, where because we were thinking. So there's this long debate, where are we going to set this? We set it in Cairo. We go to Morocco, and we eventually decided we wanted to do it in the United Arab Emirates. And anybody who's been out there, there's a tendency to sort of look at the UAE and think, it's Dubai, it's this gleaming, prosperous city that's very sterile. Big skyscrapers and shopping malls and a lot of wealth, but really devoid of culture. And I think we jointly came to the conclusion that, and you're going to think that we're both nut jobs for me saying this, but that Dubai is actually one of the most interesting places on the planet today. We as we were driving through, the Syrian civil war was at its apex at the time, and so we said, that apartment block is where all the pro-Assad people have their apartments. That apartment block is where all the resistance people have their families living.
I made that a scene in episode 2. Yeah.
All of the forces of good and evil of our modern world seem to go through Dubai. Every intelligence service is there, not just the CIA and the Mossad, but MI6 and the Russian FSB and the PLA intelligence service from China and the IRGC from Iran. Everybody's there. The Taliban is there. Al-Qaeda is there. Everybody moves their money through there. You have bankers and diplomats and aid workers and journalists and hustlers trying to make a buck and Ukrainian hookers and Filipino housemaids. And it is the crossroads of our modern world. Now, it doesn't look that way if you just show up at the airport and take a taxi to a 5-star hotel, but you start to peel back the layers, you discover there's a vibrant underground gay scene there. There's so much going on there that nobody's ever properly captured that, alas, we were trying to do.
You can see why I wanted to work with him, right?
Can I ask are any of these characters?
The short here's the short answer that's sort of flippant but also true. I've got another TV show, and if that goes, hopefully we'll do this one. We'll see. Stranger things have happened, but we both can't seem to let it go, right? And every time something amazing, as the world keeps focusing on Qatar and Abu Dhabi and stuff, we're like, we were right.
Yep.
We text each other. So we'll see.
Yeah, these guys had. The Emiratis were had all sorts of inroads into Trump. There were all these great emails from the UAE ambassador in DC that were hacked and leaked that were actually showing some of the
made up
skullduggery
actually happens. So we made up the what's over the top, but we just make that up. We're like, oh, that actually happens.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah.
Yes, question in the back there. So the question is about Rajiv's work at Starbucks and what it's like to make that dramatic change from being a foreign correspondent in dangerous zones around the world to working for Starbucks on the West Coast. And then also apparently the resignation or retirement of this I don't know about, of the CEO of Starbucks, who is
Howard
flirting-
Schultz, yep.
Howard Schultz, who is flirting with running for president.
I'll describe it differently, but I'll get to that in a second.
All right.
So, the transition for me was a real privilege. It was something completely unexpected. Most people sort of who leave the world of journalism, like a place like the Washington Post, either retire or kind of leave unwillingly because of a buyout, days when newsrooms were constricting. And I had a job I loved, but this opportunity came up to really be a storyteller in residence. I don't have to do public relations. I don't do marketing. I don't do corporate communications. I went there, and I went there at the invitation of Howard Schultz, who I'd written a book with, to think about how the company could use its scale for good in the world of content creation. So at this point, Starbucks had already committed to hire 10,000 plus veterans, providing jobs to young people who'd grown up, young people who were not in school, not in work, and it made a commitment to give even baristas who work 20 hours a week access to a full 4-year college education for free through ASU Online. So it was using its scale in those ways, but Howard thought, how could we use our reach? 13,000 stores in the United States, a mobile app that 15 million people have downloaded and is the most widely used mobile payment platform at retail point of sale. These stores have in-store Wi-Fi, and so, that's a network, if you will. And how can we think about creating content to write on that network? And how can we think about content that isn't just promotional content, isn't purely commercial, but has a social good element to it? And so that's where I came in. And so the past couple of years have really been this magical journey of experimentation, where we've experimented with different content forms and have had some great success with these short films that are really simply about ordinary people who do extraordinary things. And I don't want to take up our time by telling these stories, but they're these fascinating people that I just put on my old journalist hat out, found, and then we created these short documentaries, and we distributed them in the multiplicity of ways on the mobile app. So people, when the second season was released last fall, you could view the films on your mobile app as you were waiting to order a coffee. You could view them on the in-store Wi-Fi. We put them on our Facebook channel. We put them on YouTube. We did a deal with Audible to create an audio book. We did a deal with Amazon to stream them on Amazon Prime Video. And it was just a really exciting set of experiments for a Fortune 500 company that isn't in the media space. And we're in this world today where anybody can be a content creator. And we've been sort of trying to divine lessons from what we can do in this space that's not about making money, that's not about selling more coffee, but is about trying to advance what we broadly call our social impact agenda. As to your second question, so earlier this past week on Monday, Howard Schultz, the company's modern day founder, guy who grew the company from 11 stores in Seattle to 28,000 stores in 77 countries, announced that he's stepping down as executive chairman effective the end of this month. As you note, there's been speculation in the press about what he might do in the future. The truth is, he's taking the summer off to rest for the first time in nearly 40 years. Wake up in the morning and not worry about what were sales like the previous day, and he's going to think about a range of options. And he's certainly going to do more in the space of philanthropy. He's going to look what he said is, the range of options could include some form of public service, but he's, looking for, first and foremost as a citizen, how he can continue to have an impact on a country that has given him so much. He's an interesting guy. He grew up dirt poor in public housing in Brooklyn. His dad was interesting story here, if I may indulge for 20 seconds. His dad had a World War II veteran who had a series of dead-end jobs. And when Howard was 8, his dad delivered and picked up cloth diapers. And one day slipped on a patch of ice and broke his leg. Howard came home to find his dad laid up on the sofa in their 2-bedroom apartment in the Bayview Projects in the Canarsie neighborhood near JFK Airport. There was no health insurance, there was no workman's comp, there was no disability. The family would have run out of food if not for the generosity of family and friends. Long story short, he gets first in his family to go to college, makes this journey to Seattle, falls in love with Starbucks, quits to join Starbucks, takes a pay cut, has a chance to buy the company, manages to sort of scrape together money from friends and early investors who are willing to take a chance on him. Among the early investors is Bill Gates' father. But before the company was even profitable, he decided that he would offer every employee health insurance, and later would give every employee, even part-time barista, stock ownership. And it was the beginning of truly creating a different kind of company where, in this space where even part-time hourly workers share in the success of the company. And it's created a very unique culture there where it's not just the coffee and the experience, but it's the human connection that's driven by this remarkable love. His farewell was this outpouring of love on Monday that you see. Andrew Ross Sorkin, the New York Times journalist and CNBC morning host, came out for it, and he told me afterwards that he's been in numerous corporate events and he's never seen anything like what he saw at Starbucks on Monday.
Cool.
Another question about the possibility of running for office.
Well, he would certainly, he's somebody who is a centrist business leader, but who believes in addressing inequality and taking care of people. And I say that not through a political lens, but through kind of a description of how he has led and built the company. Putting on my old journalist hat, that's it's an interesting question. What is the state of the Democratic Party today in the era of Trump? Trump essentially took over the Republican Party, has appealed to the nativist wing of that party. You have, and has kind of hijacked it. The Democratic response thus far has been an awful lot of energy on the far progressive wing of the party, and you see that in some of the the presumptive candidates for 2020 who are people who are for instance in Congress or or hold other forms of political office. You see that in some of the midterm primary results, and I think it's going to be really interesting. What the path is for somebody who is, a moderate, let's say, more along the lines of a Bill Clinton was in '92. Does an individual like that have a path in this upcoming cycle in this in the Democratic Party in an era of Trump?
So the question's about reading. What do you read? Do you have literary heroes? And do you read for guilt?
Mm-hmm. No, for pleasure. For
pleasure. Yeah, sorry.
I read for guilt constantly, and I do not enjoy it. It's called the front page of the New York Times every day now. You know, it's funny. I was reading for the umpteenth time, speaking of the Times, in the Sunday Book Review, they have someone answering these questions like, what do you read? What are your favorite books?
It's called By the Book.
By the book. And every time I always think somewhat jealously, man, you don't read all those books. I don't believe you. I don't believe it. What do you? I'm gonna start with you. What do you read?
So it's interesting you asked that question tonight, because I always travel with a hardcover book in my bag, and it's almost always some work of nonfiction that I feel like I have to read for the moment. The most recent book, I just finished John Meacham's new book, The Soul of America, which is an interesting kind of spin through moments of crisis and adversity, reminding us that we've gotten through other dark periods before. I have been sort of starting and stopping Ron Chernow's biography of Grant. I'm not sure I'm going to fully make it through. I'm sorry if they're huge Chernow fans here. I have to say I was late to Matt Desmond's Evicted. If any of you haven't read it, it came out, I want to say a year and a half or so ago. Yeah. It's about the foreclosure crisis in America, set in Milwaukee, half told through the story of a group of African-American characters, including an African-American kind of slumlord woman, and how she evicts even, how she herself was living on the edge and her inability to sort of make the payments, and these single mothers with children who get evicted. And the other half is focused on white poor in a trailer park in another part of Milwaukee. And Desmond, who teaches at Harvard, I think he's a sociologist, essentially embedded in Milwaukee for some years. And it is a great work of true sort of, it's scholarship, but it's also narrative journalism. But guilty pleasure, for the first time, I don't know, in months, I have a work of fiction. And
what? A work of fiction?
My guilty pleasure, this is truly guilty pleasure, I'm reading David Ignatius's, who's a old mentor of mine and a columnist for the Washington Post. He, on the side, writes spy novels, and his latest book is The Quantum Spy. And so I'm reading a spy novel just for fun, and it's been ages since I've done that. So what's your guilty pleasure?
I mostly, I end up reading a lot of plays for plays to the equivalent of you reading galleys for people's books, and then reading I always feel like somehow I'm a successful in quotation playwright, but I'm just bereft of what I haven't read, so I'm constantly out of pleasure and guilt reading plays. But I read a lot of nonfiction, but it's all research based, and it's usually quite esoteric and odd. So for my guilty or non-guilty pleasure, I find there are periods of the year, often because we are in Provincetown, but I spend a lot of the summer in Brewster, where my in-laws are located. And I read a lot of fiction then, and it's physiologically, it's different. It's physiologically different to read fiction than nonfiction, let alone. And I also read hardback. I spend too much time, writing on a screen, looking at the horrors of the news on my phone. So I only want to read, physical books. Just me personally. So I don't read. I'm like, what's a guilty pleasure? I mean, I'm blanking on that, and I'll come up. But no, I am. I'm just like, well, I just feel like I'm just so happy I'm reading. I don't feel guilty about it. A book, as opposed to journalism. I would say, go back to literary influences, whatever. So much, but I find myself a lot in the last few years reading poetry and reading the Greeks, and not like reading. I'm sort of obsessed with the Iliad. I'm always reading different versions of the Iliad. And I'm trying to convince my son to become a Iliad freak as well. And I like this just came to me, but we were talking about Kapuscinski, which leads to this another thought. There's a book by Italo Calvino called 6 Memos on the Cusp of the Millennium, or 6 Memos for the New Millennium. That's sort of ideas about writing, and they're beautiful. And I think it's one of those books I think that had a great influence on me about his focus on lightness and rapidity and swiftness. And I think looking back on it, that had a big influence on me as a writer.
JT, just as maybe a hint toward
Yeah.
what you're working on, could you tell us a title or two that you're reading for research?
Oh.
Would it give us a clue to a new play, or?
I'll tell you. There's two. I'm gonna half avoid the question because I don't want to talk about the two things I'm writing, because there's that thing where you don't want to like let it out. You want to like keep it inside. But I'll do this because I don't know where it's going. But I'm stumbling on reading all these books about the sort of destruction of the classical world by the rise of Christianity and I'm sort of fascinated by it, and I don't know. I've read 3 of them now, so it might turn into something, because I'm like, well, there's a pattern there. There's 3, but yeah, there's this. In short, there's this extraordinary British historian written a book for people like me who are interested but aren't academics, and she's an academic, called The Darkening Age, and it's about the rise of Christianity in the classical world, in the Hellenistic world, and its sort of rabid, gleeful. I mean, she has a bone to pick, to be fair, but destruction of Hellenistic culture. And it's the 2 things that are extraordinary that come away from this book, and now the other books I'm reading, is the sort of this history that's totally unknown, because up until 20 years ago, all sources used to describe the rise of Christianity were all Christian sources. So the narrative has been sort of the way that we're realizing now, that the narrative about the Civil War in this country is completely bogus, that the narrative of the rise of Christianity and the fall of Hellenism was, to be simplistic. Yeah, well, the Christians, I mean, all of the pagans, they were kind of bored with their religion, and they were like happy to become Christians. It all worked out nicely. Not so much.
What's the name?
It's called The Darkening Age, and I'm forgetting, because I had a rosé slushy this afternoon, which, by the way, is so good. I'm not remembering the name of the author, but if you Google The Darkening Age, which is a title I'm kind of vexed you took because it's awesome. But the other thing is fascinating, and it's just like, any sort of spasm of religion and faith and cultural upheaval. But she very definitely never says this, but this description of our Judeo-Christian, well, not Judeo, but just Christian forefathers, and their rising up and sort of destruction of physical and of the world around them. It's ISIS. I mean, it's extraordinary, and so I don't know where that's going to lead, but it's pretty interesting.
Didn't we have something we were writing about antiquities getting sold through Dubai years before we discovered that ISIS was actually
doing that,
blowing up temples?
We were there first.
We were there first.
Yeah.
We gave ISIS the idea. Apparently.
Oh no, it's our fault. We gave ISIS the idea. Yeah.
Can you sue ISIS if they got the idea?
Yeah.
Not funny.
Yeah.
So,
Sorry. No. I keep forgetting.
The question is about how our guests perceive the fact that it appears that most of the active military in the United States is now drawn from a very narrow subset of our society, and how does that affect how we perceive war and war policy, perhaps?
Well, I'll speak briefly, and I think you're more, you're wiser and more knowledgeable about this than me. My answer is purely as a citizen. I don't think the work I do sort of gives me any particular expertise about it. I think what's interesting is I think consciously, unconsciously, perhaps more the latter, the sort of extraordinary shift in our public description of the military and our sort of hero-sizing them, if that's to coin a terrible word, the sort of rising them up as this glorious warrior caste that's extraordinary and untouchable, and the only thing in our culture that can't be criticized. I think it's a direct correlation of our guilt and our desire. If we God you up enough, we can just let you do your thing and not have to worry about it.
Could we?
Now, what do you think?
Could somebody make a show like MASH today about troops serving in Afghanistan?
No.
No way.
No, and
why is that?
Imagine like that great film Three Kings about set with American soldiers. I could never. It's too.
You could never you could never do MASH today. Three Kings, it was set in the first Gulf War, but you could never do that about the modern Iraq War. And I believe the reason is fewer than 1% of Americans have served in uniform in support of the wars post 9/11, and there's no draft, as we all know. And so that means that while, yes, the U.S. Army is the nation's is the most diverse large employer, it does disproportionately draw from poor white kids from the South, kids of color from inner city America. It is not a full-on representation of the diversity of America, and particularly not economic diversity. And so, how many, children of members of Congress, for instance, have served in the military. And so, what it gives you is, in some families, it's sort of a permanent warrior caste. You have a lot of young people who join the military because their father served and their grandfather served. And for those families, there is, the last almost 20 years have been very, very different than almost every other family in America. I mean, I had a conversation with a guy named Leroy Petrie, one of our few living Medal of Honor winners last month in Washington, D.C. And, I was telling him, if I wasn't doing this thing at Starbucks, and I said, I'd probably be writing a book set, and I don't know if it would be, an attempt at writing a novel or would be a work of researched narrative nonfiction, but set in Columbus, Georgia. Why Columbus, Georgia? It's the home of the U.S. Army's Ranger regiments. And these are the troops that have been going on a lot of the special ops missions. And there are guys who serve in the Ranger regiment who were 19 years old on 9/11, who are now, pushing 40.
And they're still there.
And they have done 17, 18 combat tours. And you have people who, their lives have been defined by this. Longest war in our nation's history. And they've had children, they've had marriages, divorces, they've lost buddies. And you could tell a story of America in the first part of the 21st century through a group of these individuals and how their lives have intersected. But their life has been defined by war for 17 years. But the vast majority of Americans have no skin in the game. And so, yes, you get this sort of lionization in part because of guilt. Like, I don't know, I know people, but a lot of people, we don't know people, we haven't, we're not sacrificing. But what that has an impact on culture, because what you get are depictions in Hollywood that are all sort of laudatory. And when those who have served, right, war is filled with absurdities. War is filled with humor, too. There are moments of grace. And when you think back to some of the ways Hollywood told stories from the Second World War, with some remove, and even from Vietnam, you had a much wider range of story told, as opposed to those being told the modern wars. And quite frankly, there's also, I would say, as somebody who's had a book turned into a war movie, audiences also have a strained relationship with it. You see these wars that are having imperfect endings, and you don't necessarily want to go to the theater to see dramatizations of it. So it's the point you make, which is a very true point, has had a profound impact on just how our culture has brought forth stories that are connected to these conflicts. Yeah. Good question. Thank you.
So thank you so much for coming out, and thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you all very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.